but you've got to get your own policies right. And of course, they're correct. I mean, there are lots that's wrong with policies. But our view has been that that is certainly true, but you ought to do something to bring international financing through the multilateral development banks into infrastructure, because in our view, even as part of PPP efforts, that would leverage a lot more private sector money. And here the debate is that there's no willingness to increase the capitalization of these institutions. So the bottom line is that we think there's a tremendous case for a big expansion of innovative World Bank, new kind of lending to support infrastructure in developing countries, not necessarily public sector infrastructure. Most developing countries, certainly India, are experimenting big time with public-private partnership in virtually every area you can think of. So actually our view, my view certainly, and I think that's also been the government's view, is to invite organizations like the World Bank to expand their lending to infrastructure in the PPP space. This requires them to behave quite differently from the way they do for normal public sector infrastructure projects. But the key thing is that I don't think there's enough willingness to expand the base of these institutions. And here, you know, one has to look at what is the size of these institutions now? And how does that compare with total capital flows? Now, one view, of course, is that we don't need these institutions. I mean, you always need the fund, but you don't need the bank. There's a capital market. You know, if you're creditworthy, you can go out there and borrow. But you know, if there's one thing that the message post-2008 is that the so-called efficient markets hypothesis in the world of international capital markets doesn't hold. And so the idea that the international capital market will finance any good investment is just not true. And this is an unresolved issue. We keep talking about it. Many of the developing countries talk about it. At the moment, what you've got is a working group co-chaired by Germany and Indonesia, which is going to look at these issues and hopefully, by the time of the summit in Australia, come up with concrete recommendations. What is it that they're actually willing to do? So, I mean, on the finance side, there are all these sorts of issues, and where, as I've said, the issues are joined, there's some progress, some things are held up. We have to wait and see how things move. Now, there are other issues which, from an economic point of view, are very important and which need to be distinguished from the finance track. Probably the two most important are really climate change and trade. Now, the difference between these two and the finance track is that the finance track has a finance minister's parallel. So whatever has to be done, the G20 finance ministers have an identity. So they have a chance to bash things out amongst themselves, and when obviously everybody's agreed, the summit just puts a seal on it and everyone feels good. Where there are differences, it gives the summit an opportunity to try to resolve issues which have not been resolved at the finance minister's level. That's not true in trade, that's not true in climate change. Now, everybody knows that trade is very important, but there's no G20 trade ministers doing a shadow sort of preparatory work. So every now and then the G20 discuss trade, but they're not really able to get to grips with what the difficulties are. So essentially what they've been doing is saying things like some kind of a voluntary holding back from additional protectionist measures and a strong call for a early resolution, conclusion, early successful conclusion of the Doha round, but that's about it. I mean, they do not actually get to the Doha round and say, look, these are the three areas that are problematic. And we, the leaders, we decide to sit with our trade ministers or commerce ministers and let's see if we can hammer out a consensus. Because here, the propriety of the discussions invariably means that the G20 leaders meet amongst themselves, but the negotiations go on in Geneva with 185 other countries. And much the same thing is happening on climate change. I mean, the G20 leaders are aware that climate change is a big issue, but the position of every one of them is that the forum for climate change discussion is the UNFCCC. So other than wanting cooperation and wanting an early resolution, it doesn't actually move the thing forward. I'm kind of oversimplifying, but to summarize, I believe that on the finance side, while there are lots of problems and lots of unresolved issues, it is genuinely possible to say that progress is being made, and that at critical moments, the presence of the leaders as an additional ad referendum forum enables you to do more than would just be possible with finance ministers. But in these other areas, the leaders talk, hopefully they go back and talk to their relevant ministers, but the dynamics of the discussion is not actually affected all that much. At least that would be a reasonable judgment to make as of now. Now, whether this can change in future is something that one has to think about. You know, one issue that always comes up, therefore, is it working? I mean, will it just degenerate? Will it go back to, you know, just the G7 and forget about the G20? Some people would say that since maybe it'll become more a G2, the US and China, forget about all the others. So there are lots of scenarios that people talk about. You know, but I think that once international institutions have an amazing capacity to perpetuate themselves, so I do not expect the G20 to, the G20 will not disappear until it has comprehensively discredited itself, and it hasn't done that yet. So whoever's involved in it has a chance to try and move this process further forward. I think there are some tensions and problems. I mean, one of the tensions is the usual elite tension that, you know, the G20 is larger than the G7, and it's kind of pleased. Everybody who wasn't in the G7 is quite pleased that the thing has been democratized to that extent. But then the issue arises that, you know, what about the G193? So the G20 is never able to resolve this issue, and even the membership is a little flexible, and each presidency invites 2 other people. I personally feel that, you know, the addition of numbers is not a good idea. I mean, 20 is a pretty large number to get any kind of chummy interaction with, but the demand for legitimacy always pushes the group into trying to do a little bit more. Another aspect of the same thing is the belief in having outreach, you know, in the sense that the G20 is always aware that we're just 20 guys, you know. We're not the Security Council. I mean, the Security Council is a small group, but the Security Council has an international legal stature. I mean, a vote in the Security Council makes international law. Security Council is not an equal body. I mean, some people have veto, some people don't, but that's all enshrined in the international system. The G20 doesn't have any comparable international stature. So nobody has to necessarily listen to the G20. Although, if it were really true that all the countries of the G20 were absolutely convinced of what they had said, and all the leaders voted that way in all the fora in which they operate, they would obviously make a huge difference. So I think there's a sort of ambivalence. But then, to get over the ambivalence, they do this thing called outreach. So what is outreach? Well, outreach now seems to be that along with the G20 meetings, they have meetings of the B20, which is a group of business people from the G20 who meet separately and for 1 hour or so interact with the leaders. They have the L20, which is a whole bunch of labor leaders from the same group that also meet separately and then interact a little bit with them. And they also have the T20. I don't know if the T20 met in St. Petersburg, the think tank 20. Now, I have to tell you that, you know, on the occasion that I went around, the T20 was a lot of fun because, you know, individuals expressing all kinds of views. But that's all an attempt to gain legitimacy, to gain a broader interest in whatever the work that they do. That's roughly, I think, where things stand. And I mean, if there are questions, I'd be happy to answer them. That's a good way of making sure that I only talk about things that you're interested in. I could go on and on and on, but I don't really want to do that. So with those words, let me thank you for listening to me so patiently. And I'd be happy to answer questions if you want to delay your dinner even longer than you really should.
Thanks, Montek. Thank you. I think ringside view and a very stimulating talk. So we'll take questions. Please identify yourselves and please be brief. Yes, Dr. Sengupta.
Nitish Sengupta, has G20 a kind of potential to overshadow the fund bank system eventually?
Fund bank system. That's a very quick answer. The answer is yes, for the simple reason that the G20 contain all the important guys who are in the IMFC. Although the governance of both the World Bank and the IMF really rests with their board of governors, since they're all weighted votes, if all the G20 agree on the IMF and the World Bank, is a done deal, because that's whatever it is, 60% or more of the vote there. And I think on critical matters, what has happened, I would say now that I'm going, two meetings take place in Washington when the annual meetings occur. One is the meeting of the IMFC, and one is the meeting of the G20. And actually what has happened is that the whole focus of attention has shifted to the G20. Because, you know, the G20 includes the largest countries. The IMFC is on a representative basis, so many of the G20 are in the IMFC, but there are a lot of people in the IMFC who are there on a rotational basis. So as far as the voting is concerned, I mean, if all the finance ministers who've decided whatever they've decided in the G20 stick to that in the IMFC 24 hours later, it's a done deal. So it does overshadow. But when you say overshadow, nothing wrong with that. I mean, in the sense that it gives the indication that for the first time, you have a finance ministers group, which is effectively doing the controlling, and you have a summit group, which could, if there were real differences, take a second look at the way things are going.
Sir, myself, Dastagiri from National Center for Agriculture Economics and Policy Research. Multi-speed world requires multi-speed functionality and multi-speed strategies. What is that G20 countries recently reforming our new policies on this aspect? Without using Pareto optimality, not affecting developing countries.
Yeah. I don't know. Are you talking about mission expanding the agenda of the G20, sir?
You know, I'm sorry, maybe because of the echo or just my own infirmities, I didn't get all of what you said.
Sir, a multi-speed world requires multi-speed functionalities and multi-speed strategies for economic growth. What is that G20 countries are focusing on new reforms or new policies which will...
very good point. Let's be clear. I agree with you that multi-everything world requires much more complex handling of policy. If you were to ask the question, has the G20 identified the areas of policy that matter as a checklist, I think you'd have to say they have. My personal view is they've identified too many. But it's very difficult to think of any policy that, I mean, you know, we've got a 80-paragraph declaration or something like that, so everything is listed there. But, you know, remember, this is not they're not the world's empowered planning commission to solve all these problems. They just look at these things and comment, and out of that try to distill a little bit of consensus. So slowly the agenda moves forward. I mean, for example, I didn't mention at all, but, you know, corruption. which doesn't normally figure in many of these discussions, is a big part of the G20 agenda, as a recognition that corruption is a problem everywhere. And, you know, then they say you've got to do this and do that and do the other, and countries are trying to do that in different ways. Corruption, water, food security, investment in infrastructure, coordination of macroeconomic management, developing a set of rules that will give you a more stable financial system. I mean,